Well, Stella Creasy is here. She is a Labour MP who has been the target of some of the pretty vile abuse and threats. And Toby Young, who's a blogger and Twitter enthusiast, who's argued that blocking and ignoring the abusers may be the best way in most cases. I just wondered what you thought of what you heard from Twitter, who say they're trying to engage, they're trying to do the best they can. It's very difficult.
I think it's frustrating for those of us who have been directly affected by this now that we're hearing different stories from both the police and from Twitter. My concern is it's not Twitter, it's not the platform itself that's making people do this and persistently do this. I'm still receiving rape and death threats today. It is people who are idiots and people who may well be escalating in their violence and aggression towards women.
So it's a social
I need
problem,
to see Twitter working with our law enforcement agencies when you've got a serious threat of violence and aggression towards somebody in the way that I have experienced, Caroline has experienced, and now unfortunately several of my colleagues in Parliament are experiencing.
But were you encouraged by what you heard from Del Harvey?
I was encouraged by what I heard from her last night, but that's 4 days after both myself and Caroline originally went to Twitter asking for help and indeed were blocked in terms of the UK staff. Del didn't there, but she has offline admitted to us that they felt they didn't get it right. My concern now is to see that got right in the UK and across the world, because actually this is about violence against women and the way in which this very old crime is using new platforms to propagate it.
What do you make about the specific problems that Twitter faces and the way they're trying to respond to it? I mean, it's very difficult for them. She made that quite clear.
Yeah, well, I think in Twitter's defence, at least they have a trust and safety division manned by human beings. The way Facebook deals with abuse is entirely computerised. So if a user is flagged up as abusive enough times, they automatically get banned. There's an algorithm that bans them. There's no invigilation of the process, and that means that people can easily abuse the abuse process and flag up people who they just politically disagree with, who end up having their pages removed. At least on Twitter, there are actual human beings investigating the complaints and making an actual informed decision.
But they don't seem to be getting somewhere, do they, in many of these cases, or if they're getting somewhere, it's very, very slow.
But I think that's partly because they're so overwhelmed by reports of abuse. I mean, Twitter is used by tens, if not hundreds of millions of people around the world, and there are, lots and lots of trolls out there, and there must be reports of abuse that Twitter is being deluged with, so it's not that surprising.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the ways in which you both deal with this, because you deal with it, you've complained, but you also retweet some of the tweets. You are followed by a lot of people, 32,000 people. Some of these rather sad cases are not followed by anybody, so however offensive it is, you're giving them a megaphone, aren't you?
I use a range of ways to deal with people who behave in offensive and abusive ways on Twitter. Sometimes I'll send them pictures of kittens because that's the level of debate I think that they deserve. Sometimes, as Toby will know, when he's perhaps crossed a line, I will retweet issues and say to people, actually, I'm going to challenge and call you out on this. Is this really acceptable behaviour? But with this is illegal. If someone walked up to me in the street and said they were going to rape me, as people have repeatedly done on Twitter over the last couple of days, I would dial 999. What we mustn't do is think that because this is happening online, it's somehow less serious. 50% of stalking cases involve both on and offline harassment. My concern is that these people are not letting go. Now, they need to understand that neither are we in treating this seriously.
You've suggested that in most cases you can just ignore it. I mean, obviously you can't ignore that.
No. I mean, I don't have a problem at all with Stella reporting people who threaten her with violence to the police, and I'm not surprised she's cross that Twitter aren't doing more to cooperate with the British police to pursue those people. I think that's totally understandable. What I'm nervous about is something Stella said to me earlier, which is that she had a conversation with the woman you just interviewed in which she persuaded her to include the word harassment in Twitter's abuse policy. So henceforth, anyone guilty of harassment will be banned from Twitter. And the problem is that's a very vague, elastic term and is open to abuse. And the worrying thing about Twitter responding to a complaint by a British politician in a way which is likely to lead to more censorious behaviour on Twitter's part is, what do they do now if a Chinese politician makes a complaint and wants Twitter to change its
You praise Twitter
policy?
for being a bit of the Wild West, and just ignoring it doesn't make it go away, does it? Even blocking it doesn't make it go away, because people can set up different accounts.
I'm sorry, Toby, but you've got to let me say, actually what it was about particular types of harassment. You can't have it both ways. You can't say what's great about Twitter is they have a manned system to look at these cases, so they have a clarity about what harassment is, and then say, oh, but they shouldn't be dealing with harassment. When I talk about harassment, I talk about things under the Protection from Harassment Act, which are, again, illegal in this country. But they also need to have a process for dealing where people get a warning. I think that's fair, isn't it, Toby?
I think that Twitter should definitely be held to account for not enforcing its own abuse policy. Right. And I read the abuse policy on the way here, and it includes not allowing local users to break local laws. So you're perfectly right to say that they should cooperate with the police if you want people to be prosecuted for breaking harassment laws. But what I don't want Twitter to do is to go beyond enforcing its existing policies and introduce more censorious policies, which are going to result in a much more anodyne, cleaned-up Twitter, which wouldn't be the social network that we know and love.
Haven't you accepted, at the beginning of this conversation, that it's not really a technical problem, it's about the way in which some men behave? It's a problem with our society, and you're never going to fix that by either blocking them or complaining to Twitter.
No, exactly. We're going to fix that by changing that culture, but one of the ways that we change that is by calling it out and having a process that says, if you continue to behave in this way, there will be consequences. It's also why we need to make sure that the police at a local level as well as a national level understand the risks and dangers that can come from online behaviour and how that manifests both offline. But fundamentally, this is about taking violence against women seriously. And Toby, I just don't think you understand it. Nobody's talking about stopping you making comments about MPs' tits. I'd really hope that you'd stop doing that on your own. But we are talking about people who repeatedly write to people, particularly contact people, who particularly say offensive and abusive things, and there's no recourse at this. What we've discovered is that Twitter doesn't have a clear process for it. What I hope they've learned from today is that they need to get one.
Okay. But it sounds like what you're saying is that Twitter ought to jump on anyone who is being offensive or abusive towards women, but ignore people who are being offensive or abusive to men.
Well,
and
when did I say that?
Well,
when did I say that?
You talked about trying to persuade Twitter to enlist Twitter in your campaign to try and re-educate men and make them less sexist. That was part of an broader campaign.
Actually, I said I'd really hope that you'd get with the 21st century and stop tweeting about women's tits in Parliament. Okay. That's completely different, isn't it? What I also said is that I agree with you. It's good that Twitter has a proposal where people themselves will look at reports of abuse. What I asked Twitter to do on Monday night was to give us some data, to give us some understanding about how many reports that they get, so we can understand the level of the difficulties that they're dealing with.
Stella, I think the problem that you're not facing up to is that if you do persuade Twitter, if you do enlist Twitter in this particular political cause of yours, it'll be much harder for Twitter to resist when they're called up and browbeaten by Chinese politicians or Saudi politicians who try and enlist Twitter
again,
in their
Toby,
particular
you've just
political
accepted
cause.
that it's about local laws, and in this country, harassment is illegal. In fact, we've strengthened the laws around stalking. So you can't have it both ways. It just seems to me that you're rather inconsistent here.
But
you either want to defend Twitter as a no man's land in which what anybody says goes, or you're saying it matters that they're accountable to local law.
My worry is that if you include the word harass in Twitter's abuse policy, which you said earlier you had persuaded Twitter to now do after a sort of 2-hour conversation last night, that they'll go beyond simply asking
But there is a
local
legal
users
definition
to
of
abide
this.
by.
There is a legal definition of it, Toby. You know that, don't you?
But it's already in Twitter's abuse policy to stop people abusing local laws. Why do they need to add the word harass? It sounds like you want them to go beyond it and
no, I want them to enforce it, and I want them to be explicit to users that harassment could lead, not in all cases to being banned, but it certainly could lead to accounts being suspended. What I'm also worried about is the idea that it takes me as a British MP to have this happen for something to change.
We haven't got more than 140 characters left, so just very briefly, did you, by any chance, tweet about women's tits in Parliament?
It wasn't my proudest moment, Gavin. I asked a particular MP who one couldn't see the head of, but was sitting behind Ed Miliband wearing an extremely low-cut dress. I committed the sin of noticing it, and apparently that constitutes harassment in some people's views.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. And you can read